We'll take a minute while he starts the cassette in the other room because we want to get it down for those who subscribe to the tape. You got it? Repeat to make sure it's there. Broadcast number 556, August the 2nd, 1982. To update the current story of Kramer versus Kramer, in case those of you haven't listened, over the past year or half a year, I've been trying to locate the background of a Mr. Fritz Kramer, the man behind Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, the chief of staff, the chief advisor in our Pentagon since 1948. And I'm trying to find out if that Mr. Kramer was Hitler's chief of staff up to the end of the war in 1945 in Europe. And I've been corresponding with Army intelligence and getting the runaround. And last week I read a letter to you from the Holocaust Center in Palestine and Jerusalem. It's supposed to be the greatest data bank for Nazi criminals, and they told me they had no record of Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kramer, the chief of staff at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, and one of Hitler's chief advisors. It's interesting they have no record of him since the war, and as I mentioned last week, there are pictures of him, a few of them, in a few history books at the Dachau trials, charged with massacring Americans at Malmedy, among other crimes, but specifically orders to take no prisoners and to gun down as many Americans they could find. Since I did the program last week, I got a letter again from Army Intelligence. I sent them one letter from the Freedom of Information Act, got the address, and they wrote back, be more specific. I gave them the birth date and the city that Fritz Kramer, the advisor to Kissinger and Haig and our other Army generals in the Pentagon, and also he advises the entire Pentagon military. And they asked me for more time, and they would send another department of the Army Intelligence, and I sent them specific information. Where was our Fritz Kramer, the German with the monocle, who came to this country and then went right to the Pentagon when the war was over? At least by 1948, he was holding this high position. And he said they still can't find any record of him, even though I sent copies of articles with his name, and he's mentioned in a new book I referred to last week about Alexander Haig. So this last week I got a letter dated July 2nd, 1982 from a Mrs. Sue Nelson in the Pentagon with her phone number. And she says, your letter dated June 24th was received from the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. We will reply to you within 10 days. We ask for an extension of time. It's needed because the response to your information that you requested must be obtained from another location. So we're still hunting Kramer versus Kramer. Is Hitler's chief of staff the chief of staff for the United States of America? This has been going on, this correspondence, since the spring of this year. And as I mentioned before, I asked Congressman Panetta to help me find out, and they won't let a congressman get this information, even though it should be available to him within 3 minutes, where this person was from 1945 to 1948. So the 10 days will be over by next week, and we'll update Kramer versus Kramer and see what the Army Intelligence tells us then. I don't want to pass over some of the coups or near coups that are taking place because Ronald Reagan is escalating his counterintelligence, his guerrilla warfare. He refers to it, the United States guerrilla warfare and counterintelligence, which means a lot of governments will change hands very quickly, and so I think every 2 weeks to 3 weeks we'll update those. I didn't mention last week there was a try to kill the Iraqi leader. He survived it. They tried to kill him. The former head of Chad, the prime minister, was decapitated by propeller blades from his helicopter. Bolivia had a coup. The new president was sworn in amid protests. This was July 22nd. Within 9 hours of moving the former president over, a new president in Bolivia was moved in. There was an attempted coup in Kenya yesterday to change that form of government. And then, of course, the big story was the Panamanian president who quit. This was July 31st this week. A shakeup coming in Panama. The president who took over after Torrijos was murdered just a year ago to the day was removed. A new president is in. All newspapers are suspended. All publications are stopped for 7 days. All cabinet members are changed. There is an irrevocable resignation of the other president. And a new president has come in and has literally decided, I will hold the government still for a time now. As I say, the press and newspapers aren't running it. Every person who's in power has to be out. I forgot to mention also that Mr. Guzman of the Dominican Republic was killed just shortly before he was to step down. A new president was to come in, and that was just a week after Edward Wilson had been brought back to the United States and was seeking asylum in the Dominican Republic. And I'll do more about Guzman and the links to Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon later. But the Dominican president was killed. That was last month. Now, the Panamanian government changed hands very quickly. I mentioned briefly last week that Edwin Meese's son, the one from West Point, was down at Panama just at the time his brother was killed in Washington, D.C. in the car crash. The West Point son was down in Panama, and the Panamanian government changed hands just about 3 days later. The importance of the Panamanian story has to do with the Vatican scandals that are finally making the front page of Wall Street Journal and the front page of the financial section of the LA Times, and I want to go at length with you into those articles because it's taken 7 years for these newspapers and for NBC and CBS and the major networks to have on their news, even for 5 minutes, a scandal that is affecting over 250 banks around the world, including California banks and European banks, and the capability of closing many banks is there, the potential, because of millions of dollars, billions floating around and collapsing. So finally, with the murder of Roberto Calvi and some of these other strange murders that are taking place around the world, the newspapers are beginning to give it attention. Incidentally, next week I'll go back to the story of the murder of the executive of Charter Oil. There are also large publication chains, many of the magazines you see at the newsstand, but Charter Oil was closely linked to Robert Vesco and Billy Carter and Mr. Torrijos of Panama, who was killed last year. And just at the time the Panamanian crisis is coming down, the president of Charter Oil and his top executives were killed in Ireland. And last week, remember, 2 weeks ago, the former chairman of Lockheed and his wife were murdered, and there's been no follow-up of that either. There's a cause and effect event taking place here, and a lot of people are going to be directly linked to these scandals. And briefly, I might mention their names and then come back to the details of their links later, but I want you to know they're in the news. Now, just in Time magazine, July 26th, there's the story of Paul Marcinkus, the Vatican, the scandal at the Pope's Bank, and I referred to it last week. And one of the sentences in that article says the most damaging of the disclosures were documents that directly implicated Archbishop Marcinkus. He's the chief financier for the Vatican and the Pope's bodyguard. The Archbishop signed letters of patronage for the dozen Panamanian ghost companies that received loan money from Banco Ambrosiano. That was only $1,400,000,000 in 10 dummy fronts in Panama. Now, that was in Time magazine, July 26, and within 3 or 4 days later, the entire government of Panama and every person in power was automatically fired, and they're setting up a new government. And it's hard to believe that there wasn't a cause and effect relationship between the dummy fronts in Panama. Now, it might be of interest for those of you who study Jonestown, because many people who take these tapes are studying the Jonestown story also, or listening to this broadcast. In the last year, or not last year, it was 1979. The years go so fast. October 26, 1979, UPI story that came out of San Francisco Chronicle, and of course across the nation, was that the people's money, a lot of it, People's Temple, the Jonestown money, was found in Panama. Now, we're talking about a situation in 1978 and 1979 where $5.2 million was in one bank in Panama and $2 million was in another bank. There was over $7 million in Panama alone. The money was taken from banks in Switzerland, from Swiss bank accounts, and put into Panama, $7 million. Now, the route that Roberto Calvi and the Vatican used was to take the money out of the Italian banks and put it into the Swiss accounts and then put it into Panama. I have the names of 4 of the banks that the Vatican used in Panama. I called Joe Holsinger this week. He was Leo Ryan's assistant, and asked him if there's some way we can get, and I know there will be, to get the names of the banks in Panama that Jim Jones used, because I think they will tie up closely to Paul Marcinkus and the Vatican, because Marcinkus from Illinois, from Cicero, Illinois, is working with the United States FBI and CIA and taking money out of the banks of Italy into the Swiss banks and down into these countries, which has been documented over again. And there was no explanation of where Jim Jones would get $7 million for Panama. He had other money, or Swiss banks. The people that belonged in his entourage that died down in Jonestown were not the equivalent of these millions of dollars, $10 or $14 million. There was another article in the Washington Post. The Swiss blocked the bank accounts of People's Temple, and there was more than $10 million in Swiss banks when the People's Temple, when the deaths took place, but $7 million was in Panama. So look for the names of the banks if you researchers that have been working on the Jonestown, and help me find the names of the banks, because I have the names of the banks, not the 10 dummy fronts that Paul Marcinkus, the Archbishop, set up down there, but 4 of the main banks in Panama. And if they overlap, and I think they should because of the interrelationship of our various agencies with this counterintelligence operation that has gone under the cloak of religion that has nothing to do with religion. If we check this out, we have a lead to some very big stories, and I think they will come out to be similar accounts that were funded in there for the Jonestown operation. Now, I enjoy talking about high society, about the Ronald Reagan administration, because Nancy and Ronnie have this complex about being such high aristocracy or regal monarchy. They have the monarchy complex with nothing to substantiate the farce that they put on all the time. And the higher they climb, the harder they fall sometimes. So it's really jovial and sad at the same time to see some of the shenanigans going on in the White House and around these people. And I just want to run down a few stories of the so-called moral majority, the far-right GOP, because they put on this holier-than-thou attitude towards the hippies, towards the young people, towards the counterculture, and yet their track record isn't very good for all they're doing. And there are a few stories in the news this week. One is the lawsuit that this Vicky Morgan has against Betsy Bloomingdale. Many of you might have seen it, and many of you might not have. The Los Angeles Times and the LA Herald had stories about it. She's suing Alfred Bloomingdale, that is the closest friend of Ronald Reagan, and suing his wife because she satisfies his needs. This mistress of 12 years, and the mother probably of that 12-year-old son is probably Alfred Bloomingdale, that he takes care of also. She said she takes care of his Marquis de Sade complex. In the LA Times, had an article about sadism and sadomasochism and the sexual benefits of the usual torture and the whips and chains. And so the very best friend of Nancy Reagan is being sued because she has stopped the contractual duties that she was giving Betsy's husband in allowing the sadism and so forth. So I haven't heard so much scandal since the time that Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw in New Orleans, and out came the masks and the whips and chains. So that now Betsy Bloomingdale is being sued because this woman, Vicky, was supposed to satisfy her husband, and they cut off her funds. Another long story about this matter. And then a psychiatrist from UCLA, Dr. Joshua Golden, a therapist in the Human Sexuality Clinic, goes into what the Marquis de Sade complex is and the use of masochistic behavior and bondage, and explains it's a perfectly normal activity. There's nothing wrong with it. Of course, he's from the UCLA clinic, the neuropsychiatric clinic run by Jolly West, who was Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, and also Jack Ruby's links to Clay Shaw again. It makes a full cycle to the New Orleans gang. So Betsy Bloomingdale is being sued now because she cut off the money when this woman was giving therapy to her husband. In terms of the castle and the gentleman, Mr. Fagan, entering the Queen's bedroom, I just have one comment this week. Mr. Fagan said that he had been at Windsor Castle before, in case you're, not Windsor Castle, the Buckingham Palace. He said he was in the Queen's bedroom at the Buckingham Palace when the Queen was entertaining Ronald Reagan at Windsor Castle. He says he's been there many times, and this is how he knew which room to go to. In case you've seen the floor plan with the many, many rooms, that's how he knew which door to open. He would happen to be in that room. Now, he didn't say who else was in the room with him at the time, but when she was over at Windsor Castle with Ronald Reagan, he was in her bedroom, and probably, as the London Times says, the scandal will get larger. Probably there'll be more about what he was doing in the room before. He came in the evening, that early morning, that she was there, but he already knew the floor plan and how to get in. So much for that. Now, there was a fellow arrested out here in California. His name is Manu Kanani. This was in the San Francisco Examiner this week. He's an aide of Idi Amin, you know, that refined character that Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple armed with their torture machines and so forth. Manu Kanani was running a house of prostitution for the Bohemian Grove bachelors to live it up, our great heads of states. He was providing sex for the Bohemian Grove people and was arrested for pandering. He was using a home called Northwood, which was the home of the Senator Nolan from California, another upright, just prominent GOP. Probably some of you are too young to remember Nolan. His estate is close to the Bohemian Grove, and he was satisfying the needs of the husbands on vacation in that area. Last week, I referred briefly to Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano and their work in the Bay of Pigs, working with a team, Renanda Oliva particularly, involved with the murder of John Kennedy. Al Califano of the CIA and the Defense Department worked with Alexander Haig and hired Haig when he was just a young punk in the military, hadn't worked his way up to be the generals, skipping over the main generals, what was it, 243 of them, to become the top dog with Fritz Kramer. Joseph Califano had hired Haig, and Haig had hired Ernita Oliva, who was involved in the Bay of Pigs operation, and then released him after John Kennedy was murdered because they didn't need him anymore in that capacity. Well, with those credentials, Joseph Califano, who was also Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Jimmy Carter, has been hired by Congress to investigate the sex drug inquiry. We heard about the pages and the drugs of members of Congressmen and the use of these young people for homosexual or other sexual advances to people underage, the pages working there, and the drug traffic among members of Congress. So who would be better to investigate it but the same person I referred to last week who works with Haig and the counterintelligence group? It's the same old Joseph Califano. Whenever there's scandals in Washington, they have to keep bringing the same people to investigate and to look into each other's work, whether it's Mr. Baker, Leon Jaworski, or Joseph Califano. They can't let any new young person handle this because the old team has so much blackmail and goods on each other, and in comes Califano to look into the drug and sex, which is like the fox guarding the chicken house. Newsweek had an article on ex-CIA agent picks a New York lawyer. You know how many times since 1979 I've talked about Edwin Wilson and his shenanigans on these programs. Well, now he switched his lawyer. Edwin Wilson is home. He's one of the top men of the entire intelligence operation who headed assassination teams for the CIA, for Navy intelligence. He's home now on various charges from A to Z, arming Gaddafi, hiring people for murder. He's the one with the $20 million bond I mentioned last week that wasn't reduced because he had been arranging to hire somebody to kill the U.S. prosecutor who brought him home. Well, he's changed his attorney now. He's changed it to Harold Price Fahringer, Fahranger. Now, Fahringer's clients are Klaus von Bulow and Jean Harris, and I keep promising to update the Dr. Tarnower Jean Harris story. She has been a bag woman for the CIA. She has worked with Tarnower, traveling all over the world, and very close links to the Soviet embassy just before Lee Harvey Oswald arrived, and connections to the intelligence agencies. She ran the Madeira School, which was in Washington, D.C., and worked with CIA people there in Maryland. Well, Klaus von Bulow is a client of this particular lawyer, Fahringer, as is Jean Harris, and then along comes Mr. Edwin Wilson and says, I'll take him for my lawyer. Now, Klaus von Bulow, I referred to him, this was in April of this year, this broadcast 542. He was involved with the perfumer affair. He was involved with a horror chamber of sex rings, sadomasochism, similar to what Alfred Bloomingdale enjoys with his Vicky Morgan. And there was a long series of British scandals, Christine Keeler, and the trial that came out with Mr. Ward in Great Britain was when Ward was put on bail, he was murdered, and this Klaus van Bulow had put up the money for him, and then Lord Lucan escaped. He had murdered the governess, had tried to kill his wife, and he was a close friend of von Bulow. So again, our CIA gang, Edwin Wilson, is in the company of von Bulow, and the common attorney, the common denominator between all of them is the CIA, the sadomasochism, multiple murders behind them. Keep in mind, Edwin Wilson was one of the top officials working under George Bush, our vice president in the CIA, with Navy intelligence, with the Nugan Hand Bank assassination team. So when they change lawyers or take on lawyers, they have the same teams. And just a brief word about our Senator John Schmitz in California, one of the most rabid anti-women representatives. He was a member of one of the original founders of the Birch Society. He tried to run for Senate of the United States this year. He has a woman works for at the Marine base at El Toro, Carla Verne Stuckel, and he's been married 20 years with 7 children. It turned out that when one of his children with this other woman, Carla, was put into a hospital, it turned out that he's lived with her for 6 or 7 years and has 2 children by her, but one of them almost had his penis severed. There was hair wrapped around it, and they described it as one of the worst, one of the sickest cases of torture. This child had been suffering for 2 to 3 weeks, finally was put in the hospital to have the penis reconstructed to attach it so that it's still there. His answer to all of this was, I thought I would be the father of the year, the man of the year, because I don't believe in abortions. He's the best argument for abortions I've ever seen. If you have to have children and torture them and treat them in this way, you don't care about what's happening to them. It's a horrible story, but he's been our very conservative congressman, senator in California, and you're just lucky that you didn't get him at a national level. At least he was knocked out of the primaries. Now, this woman says that he hasn't showed up since this broke in the news, since the little boy was taken away from her. She's supposed to be on $25,000 bail, but they let her without bond. He took a powder and disappeared, and she said, King Edward VIII gave up his throne to marry the woman he loved. Why can't John do something? Well, John isn't Edward VIII, and Edward VIII didn't have 7 children at home, and John isn't doing anything but hiding, but the whole story is so disgusting. But again, it goes back to what I call high society, whether it's the Bohemian Grove, whether it's the Alfred Bloomingdales, whether it's Senator Schmidt from California, pretty crummy crowd trying to present themselves as respectable, and more is coming out every day. And Jack Anderson had an article this week, again referring to our Secretary of Labor and Mr. Fred Farino that was murdered June the 11th. And the FBI has the papers, and they're going into it. And I saw, besides Jack Anderson, that they're going to investigate the Secretary of Labor and his links to the Genovese family, to mafia and organized crime. It seems to me that we could be getting something better in Washington, but we're obviously not. And as long as the pieces keep falling out, I'll explain them, because I'm sick of these people putting on pretense. They're not serving us well. They're not serving the people. They're putting on their pretense, and yet all this news is coming around to show really how rotten they are. And finally, several weeks ago, I did a summary of what was happening simultaneously in this country and in Europe and Switzerland. And I want to reiterate it because there's a picture in Newsweek. It's the June 21st Newsweek, and it summarizes the whole week. Ronald Reagan is standing as master of ceremonies in Great Britain. It's called the Upstage Summit, and to the right of him is Princess Margaret, and to the left is Queen Elizabeth. And these two women look like they are sitting on tacks or eating their vomit. They look absolutely miserable. If you think royalty is fun, get a hold of the Newsweek and look at the picture. And there is Ronnie up above the actor, holding his hands and doing the part he's supposed to do. And down below is the Pope, who's another actor. And I'm going on the second half of this broadcast to go into 3 top stories of the Vatican. But these pictures, if one picture can say 1,000 words, this is it, the misery. Now, what was going on while he was at this party at Windsor Castle? Mr. Fagan was over there at the other castle in the Queen's bedroom. Roberto Calvi was missing and found hanging over a bridge. His secretary was flying out of that window in Milan. Mr. Raymond Donovan was in Geneva, Switzerland, where Fred Farina was in a trunk in a car in New York City. Edwin Wilson was coming home with his track record of trying to arrange to kill the prosecutor. John Hinckley was let off that week. Haig was soon to be fired. And the news stories were so horrendous of that week that I keep going back to that one week because it set the stage for so many other things that are coming down now. As a matter of fact, July the 12th in Newsweek, there's a story how Alexander Haig was helping Mr. Schultz get ready to become Secretary of State. Now, that's very important because Haig wasn't fired right after that trip because of a whim. He was fired because of the links to the Italian scandals, to NATO, to the banking scandals going on in England and Europe. And they sent Mr. Schultz over to Europe to the Versailles summit before to meet the people, to get to know his way around. Haig was going to be out. And if you look at the pictures in Time and Newsweek that week also, July the 5th, you see a picture of Haig that's so somber you can't believe it. And July the 5th, there's 4 pictures of Haig, one after the other, where he is looking terrible. And as I say, Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret and all of them are meeting and trying to put on a show. The British banks are millions of dollars behind in interest payments coming out of Rome, out of the Vatican, out of these tangled banks, these dummy fronts caught into the most nefarious, mysterious accounts that will link to murders, will link to organized crime, to the mafia, to the Genovese, the Gambino family. And how are they going to extricate themselves? They have to stop killing witnesses at some point. They do have to stop that. There's another article just in May 31st in Time. Death threat. Donovan, our Secretary of Labor, sending death threats, mafia-type death threats to the Senate Investigation Committee of his links to the mafia. Edwin Wilson, a government employee, 21 years, death threats to his investigator. And primary witness, the president of the Banco Ambrosiano in Italy, hanging off of a cliff. Only London said it was a suicide. The other articles have said he couldn't have gotten into that position, and the windows were too narrow where the secretary went out in Milan. Now, there were judges and investigators that were murdered in Italy, in Milan, and other cities trying to get into this case. Eventually, the murders have to stop, and I keep bringing them up because at some point, the activities of these people for the past 25 years have to be laid out. People have to recognize it. They have to see the damage they're doing to banks around the world. And I'm going to begin with one story that came out in 1976 of Paul Marcinkus, the role of the Vatican in putting loans to FBI people in New Jersey, New York, and Florida. How can Paul Marcinkus, the treasurer of the Vatican, give up to $1 million in unsecured loans to the police departments and the FBI in the United States? What does that have to do with the church, with God, with religion? And I'm not talking about the Catholic religion. I'm talking about people who are running their bank, who are making Italians angry. What business do they have tangling our banks like the Franklin National Bank in New York or banks in New Jersey, the Security National Bank in New Jersey, and how many other agencies, FBI and police, are tangled into this? I'm going to give you a few examples of some important stories in a minute. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to the story of these entangled banks. Okay, this is May. Do we get a 1-minute break there? Okay, this is May, and this is side 2 of broadcast number 556, August 2nd, 1982. Okay. Now, in 1976, that's a long time ago, 1976, there was an article by Richard Phelan in the New York Times. For those of you that subscribe to the tapes, I had the information in the bibliography of this on tape 553, but I didn't get a chance to put it on the air that week. It's a story about the Security National Bank of New Jersey that was routinely making unsecured loans to the FBI in the United States. I bring this up now because the banks in Italy and the Vatican banks are missing billions of dollars, 1.4 billion just in Panama alone, but millions of dollars have been gone out of the banks in Luxembourg, in Liechtenstein, in Milan, out of the Swiss banks, money taken from these various countries, put into Swiss banks, and gone. So in New Jersey in 1976, the Vatican was making routinely unsecured loans to members of the FBI, and they were making them in New Jersey, they were making them in New York, and in Florida as far back as 1976. Now, this one article in the New York Times, this is dated July the 12th, 1976, in case you want to look it up, they were handing out money to FBI agents. Many of the 300 unsecured loans were on the books, 300 in New Jersey alone. Now, keep in mind, this is where the organized crime is going to put their casinos. New Jersey is the location of the Jimmy Hoffa Teamsters confrontations, and a lot has been going on in New Jersey. And this particular bank, the Security National Bank, found that there were oddities in the financing, in the control of this bank, and that $1 million of investments were made by a Swiss subsidiary called Banca di Roma. And they couldn't figure out this $1 million of investments that was made from Rome. And it seemed that when they investigated, they thought it could have come from the Vatican Bank, and it did come from the Vatican Bank. And the implications were that the treasurer of the Eastern province of the Roman Catholic Order had moved money into this particular bank in New Jersey, and they were going to try to take it over. And under his supervision, he took these treasury bills and had taken the money from Europe and Switzerland into this bank as a way of a takeover, although it was Vatican money. And they found out that a lot of this money was drained out, and a John Federican, he's 52 years old at the time, was president of a group called the Bessemer Trust Company, and he raised $2 million. And the way he raised it was that he went to Paris and Geneva and Rome, and he worked with Michael Sindona, and Sindona was responsible for the collapsing of the Franklin National Bank in New York City in 1974, 1975. And this man he got introductions, and he was associated with Paul Marcinkus, the man who's in the news right now and who was supposed to have been replaced last week as the head of the bank in the Vatican. But this fellow was close to Marcinkus, and then he met another financier in Palm Beach, Florida, a Canadian financier that he worked with who also was pouring money into the bank. His name is Charles Burns. Now, what happened was they got wind of these loans to FBI agents because the Security National Bank of New Jersey was going to merge with the Security National Bank of Long Island. And those two banks were going to combine with the Chemical Bank of Long Island in 1976. And the troubles in Newark and New Jersey began when they started to check out the Security National Bank, that particular bank, and found that there was $30 million in that bank that had been raised, but it came in from overseas into their bank as an attempt for a takeover. And they were challenging this money that was coming in the process of finding out that this money came from Rome and Geneva and Paris. It had to do with Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. And the scandal about this, the bad part about it, was why were these loans coming in? Why was the money coming in? And money was going out to FBI men who got very low interest or no collateral at all or didn't pay off the loans. So money was being poured in from European banks to agents of the FBI in New Jersey, in New York, and in Miami from the Vatican. Now, what has that got to do with law enforcement in the United States? There recently was a case in New Jersey where a coroner was removed. He put a death certificate that a man died of natural causes. The family was suspicious. They dug up the body, and there were 4 bullets in the body. This is not uncommon, but the point is that these people are being paid off from overseas money, and how much overseas money, and particularly from a religious institution of any kind, is tampering with law enforcement in the United States. Now, this goes back to 1976 that this story broke, but the same names are in the news today, that these loans were coming. As I say, they only named 3 cities, but it could be going in all over the United States. And the missing money that the Vatican is missing, 20 to 26 million a year, How much of it has been siphoned to police in Paraguay, Uruguay, Guatemala? How many radical priests are murdered? How many nuns that are trying to change society? How many people are being paid off? Is it going to the so-called law enforcement all over the world to keep political radicals murdered or silenced? Where is it going? We know that the FBI doesn't investigate anything from John Kennedy's assassination up through Watergate or any other major scandal, whether it's John Hinckley or Arthur Bremer or Sirhan Sirhan. The FBI has covered over all of these investigations in a way that the private researchers like myself have tried to open them up. And they continue to cover them. Are they under the pay of some other source? Do they go to the bank and pick up money for homes or a way to live that we don't know about? Now, the investigation of this particular account showed that $30 million portfolio of the Carthusian Order of Monks was brought out here to the New Jersey Bank, and a $4 million portfolio of the Eastern Province of Passionists, the headquarters in Union City, New Jersey. And as I say, we could do 1 hour on the Union City, New Jersey. They ran 6 retreat houses. They generated the bulk of the funds, and this money, as I say, was going, a lot of it, to law enforcement people. And then there was a story in the New York Times, the same story, and they said the person, this Mr. Fadigan, was in touch with the Archbishop Marcinkus. It was and then this is the print in the newspaper, the WDWDWDLYL that brought Fadigan in touch with Marcinkus. Now, another person that helped Mr. Fadigan bring this $30 million into that bank that went to the law enforcement people was a man named Mr. Manini, who just last week was prosecuted and given a warrant with Paul Marcinkus. Luigo Manini, who is the director of the Banca di Roma, a subsidiary in Switzerland, who's also employed by the Institute of Religion in the private bank of the Vatican. Both Marcinkus and Manini were given warrants last week that the Vatican wouldn't accept because they said it came in the mail and it was supposed to be handed to them. But in 1976, these names were linked to law enforcement in the United States in 3 cities alone, millions of dollars going from Europe into New Jersey, New York, and Florida. That was 1976. It's 1982. It's that many years later. And 2 of the men have been served warrants just this last week, which is a little late in investigating those kind of shenanigans. Now, one of the banks that they were writing money on back in 1977, November 77, was the Banca di Roma. Well, right after they used that in 1976, the Banca di Roma went under and defaulted. The Banca Privata that Mr. Sindona and Marcinkus were working with, and the Roman banks, they went under $214 million in 1974. The Franklin Bank in New York, $45 million. The Banca di Roma slipped $100 million into Zurich, Switzerland. I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, but the reason it's important now is that the heads of Europe were meeting this week because 250 banks, including the Bank of America in California, the Wells Fargo Bank, many banks around the world, could collapse suddenly like the Franklin National Bank, and you would find yourself without hardly any savings. There are a lot of people that have been hurt by these round figures that I'm throwing out. We can't even begin to estimate how many have been hurt, but it's something to be alerted to. And while the heads of states are whining and dining each other and acting very cutesy, it's a very serious situation. And the most serious thing about it is that they won't tell where the money went. Well, I've been talking about this since 1974, 75, when Michael Sindona was involved in the New York banks. And it took that many years until actually this last week, July 29th, 1982, the New York Times, not the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, finally ran a front page story. Vatican Vortex. Pope John Paul deals with rising turmoil and budget problems. There's all the front page headlines of it. Bank scandal, strike threat, and fight with the Jesuits, Mars' image abroad. Shades of a Reformation, ? And the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the half page inside on the third page is a story in the parallels of Pope John Paul II to Ronald Reagan are so overwhelming because when one was being an actor in Hollywood, and he was working for General Electric, which was one of the major corporations that financed Hitler. He was making movies with Errol Flynn in 1942 alone, when Errol Flynn was working for the Gestapo. This is Ronald Reagan. Pope John Paul was working at Auschwitz for I.G. Farben. He goes on to Rome to be the protege of Montini, Secretary of the Vatican Montini, who becomes Pope Paul VI. And Reagan becomes groomed by the Hoover Institute and the powers that be to become President of the United States. So now they are the rulers of the Vatican and the United States, and the similarities of these people are tremendous. But I'm going to talk about the Wall Street Journal article because the media has been so kind to this Polish Pope and to his image that I want to bring out some of the points on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, because when they finally admit there's a problem, they don't go very kindly. They bring out a lot of problems. In essence, what they said was that the papacy has a glittering media success. We know that. That there's unsavory financial scandals in Europe. That there are strike threats at the Vatican of resentful workers. That there's a bitter conflict between the powerful lieutenants around the Pope. That there are ideological objections to his unending orthodoxy. They compare his media success, his most famous personality, but will it tarnish his papacy, they're finally asking. And the article goes on to say the Pope has ignored the Vatican Curia. He's turned his back on them. He roams around the world. He depends upon a few aides. He ignores all the others. He has financial difficulties, and he won't answer the questions. There's a mystery surrounding the bank because of the death of Roberto Calvi. This is all the Wall Street Journal this last week. That Pope John Paul is feuding with 28,000 members of the Society of Jesus over political and social philosophy. That their labor strike is about to happen. That his own private guards, the Swiss guards, want to strike. He's paying $200 a month to employees. There's 730 residents there. The Vatican has no money to pay them, and yet he's telling Solidarity and Lech Walesa about wages and labor and the right to strike, and the pay employees at the Vatican are ready to go on strike. They are questioning his intellectual qualities. I mean, finally, they really socked it in one story. Pope John Paul's intellectual qualities are being questioned. He hasn't said one smart thing since he was Pope, but finally they're socking it to him. They said he has a simplified view of the church's role. Isn't that Ronald Reagan with the United States of America? His views and thinking are based on a monolithic Church of Poland. He's out of contact with churches in other countries. They said his stern social morality is losing interest, that the Catholics will use birth control. They don't pay any attention to him. Some believe John Paul II was a mistake. The reason I'm saying these things is that for a long time, since he was made the Pope, I've brought up issues that people thought I was singling out, maybe people understood. But now the world leaders and the Vatican themselves and the Italian church people are really getting fed up with the scandals. Now, they said the best way to discredit the Pope is to get to Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. The point is that when the Vatican was losing $20 to $26 million a year for all these past years, why did the Pope have to keep Marcinkus in charge of the money? He's the traveling bodyguard. He's in charge of arranging the Vatican itself. No one wants to discredit the Pope. Why doesn't he get rid of them? What is the bondage between these two? Just like Ronald Reagan can't get rid of Mr. Donovan, the Secretary of Labor, with his connections in New Jersey. What is the bondage that holds those two people, these people, together? The Wall Street Journal says the Curia, the Italian Curia, and others dislike Marcinkus. Can you blame him? They said the longer the financial irregularities continue, the more doubt will accumulate about the probity of the church itself and about John Paul's leadership. This is Wall Street Journal. The more the financial irregularities, well, wait till they get to those 10 dummy fronts in Panama, because Mr. Marcinkus just resigned as the board of directors of the Bahamas Bank, and goodness knows the nefarious organized crime political connections to Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and all the shenanigans of their traveling salesmen and the whole era of dirt that I've been trying to expose for the past 11 years. This article says the Reformation started with questions like this. Who's paying the money to Rome? The Wall Street Journal asked, and for what purpose? The author gave the wrong question. They said, who's paying Rome? That's the wrong question. The question should be, who let the money out of Rome? Where did it go? The Pope isn't rich and Rome isn't rich. He rephrased it wrong. It's not who's paying Rome, for what purpose. It's where did the money go out? Why did all the money of Italy go into banks shared by the Vatican, into Swiss banks, and into Luxembourg and Liechtenstein and Zurich, and et cetera, and then down to South America and into New Jersey and Florida and et cetera? The Wall Street Journal says the key is the Banco Ambrosione, and that is the key that broke these scandals open. It says if the Vatican has to come up with the money, if it's binding that they have to come up with $1.4 billion, they don't have that kind of money. They have maybe $300 million cash. And the banks of Europe, you see, are crying. There's $400 million interest alone to the Queen's Bank in London that the Queen of England and the royal family has over in London that I mentioned before. The mystery, according to the Wall Street Journal, is the circumstances surrounding why the Vatican would back the loans made by Ambrosione. What is going on in Panama that the Vatican would put up the money? The financial repercussions for the Pope would be serious. I'm reading an outline that I did of the Wall Street Journal article. The Vatican potentially is liable for these loans. Their budget is already in trouble. They have a budget of $75 million a year, a deficit of $20 million every year. They have an annual investment report coming back, and church members now are holding off money since Cardinal Cody had a woman companion who received $1 million in Chicago. They're wondering where their money goes and who's the woman and how did she get the million and what's it for, so that people from around the world are holding back their money. Now, a second article that was in the financial section of Los Angeles Times this past week, July 29th, the title is The Repercussions on European Loan System Feared. The Banking Scandal Jolts the Vatican. A banking scandal that has cost at least 2 lives and threatens perhaps half the Vatican's financial holdings has aroused concern, according to the Los Angeles Times, over the potential repercussions of the European banking system. You see, what I'm talking about here is the private ownership of people putting money into over 250 banks, and maybe 8 or 10 or 12 have collapsed, and deaths are following of important people. Governments are changing hands overnight. The newspapers are not rolling in Panama alone. They've stopped all news. I guess till this story blows over, there's no newspapers rolling, even in Panama. But it spreads to countries all over the world, and money is tied up. And that is the problem that is presented, but people have let it go so long. The very officials that are writing about now, and the writers, could have asked the questions earlier, but they didn't. And the Los Angeles Times article begins by saying the scandal has cost at least 2 lives, and they suggest that Mr. Calvi and his secretary were murdered. Well, we know that Mr. Sindona, the financier for the Vatican, and the Secretary of the Treasury under Richard Nixon, Mr. Kennedy, along with others, have been charged with murder in a court in New York City for killing an investigator into some of the banking of Mr. Sindona, along with Mr. Kennedy from the Illinois bank that is also having trouble linked to Oklahoma and the Chase Manhattan. So the Los Angeles Times brings out the story of God's banker, Roberto Calvi, how they are doing a special audit of Banco Ambrosione now about the dubious loans, about the secrecy shrouded into the Institute for Religious Works. This Times article says that Mr. Calvi was illegally exporting millions of dollars to Switzerland. See, that was the route from Switzerland down to Panama, and that's the way Jonestown, Jim Jones had his millions of dollars, $10 to $14 million from Switzerland down to Panama. 7 of it he had right in Panama. Mr. Calvi, who died, was linked to the P2 scandal, which was the direct links to Alexander Haig and NATO and the plans to put in a military dictatorship in Italy and in other countries. And Calvi is also closely associated with Michael Sindona. He's linked to the P2 scandal, to the emptying of the banks in Italy, to the Vatican loans that they signed in Panama, and to Mr. Sindona and he caused the Vatican Bank alone to lose $70 million. Those aren't the signatures in Panama for $1,400,000,000. $70 million alone the Vatican lost thanks to Calvi in Sedona. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, according to the LA Times, is the central figure in the Vatican involvement. He is the central figure. He is the Pope's closest advisor. He's his bodyguard on foreign trips. He's the governor of Vatican City. He's the head of the Vatican Bank. And the loans of Banco Ambrosiano remain unexplained. They can't find out why they were made, and that is the scandal. See, it isn't the fact that these banks can't come up with the money for their debts. Poland has borrowed millions of dollars in world banks and can't come up with the money or the explanation, even the interest on the money. Poland and Romania are breaking the banks of Europe and the United States. Another 250 banks that are being broken by missing billions of dollars from Romania and Poland. But Mr. Marcinkus, in charge of the bodyguard of the Pope, the governor of Vatican City, the head of the bank, cannot explain where the money goes. Now, it is really ridiculous to think that he would take $1 million out of the Vatican Bank and not have anything on the books to explain it. But $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, when you go to $70 million, think how long this has gone on, the repercussions of it. I bring it up as these new articles come out because the implications are so tremendous. And I think there's one answer of where it's going. I think it is going into police departments. I think it's going into newspaper people. I think it's going into these planned military coups, to the plan that they had to take the Falklands from Argentina, the Seychelles Islands, the Dominica that failed. They haven't tightened up their act, but I think there is an intent to have a Fourth Reich survive, and that these millions and billions are being salted away while the domestic banks in America and in Europe go broke. It can't be that it's unaccountable, all this money from so many different banks. I mean, I can see one person say at the Wells Fargo in Beverly Hills letting 23 million slip, or 200 or 300 million. But if I have time one night, I think for 1 hour, I'll just talk and add up with you some of the stories of the missing millions. But because this is a religious institution and it is making the major networks, the evening news this week once, it'll make it later. They don't like to talk about it. But the LA Times has a story about the foreign subsidiaries of the European banks that are not protected, that Italy isn't responsible for those signatures. The Vatican is not a country responsible for them, and the money's been sent abroad. And there was a meeting this last week because 250 American and European banks are involved in this. And the Italians themselves are pointing to the Vatican Bank responsible for this. The Vatican Bank was worth $400 million to $2 billion. But the debts are mounting up, and the newspapers, the major newspapers, are really covering it now. And finally, the San Francisco Examiner had a story this last week. Italy wants to question the bank about the dealings. They've sent warrants out, as I said. They were refused by the Vatican. They said they have to be sent in person. You can't mail them. And in the Examiner, they referred to Mr. Manini, the Vatican Bank delegate, who got one of the warrants. This is in 1982, and I read you an article from 1968 where Paul Marcinkus and Mr. Manini were involved then in shenanigans of flowing $30 million to New Jersey to a bank and trying to take over a bank in New Jersey that they would control and fund loans, no collateral, to our law enforcement agencies in New York, New Jersey, and in Florida. So that wherever the money is floating, if you take, say, the FBI people, up to $1 million handed out in one city alone, like Union City, New Jersey, how many law enforcement do they control? How many police do they control? How can a man from Cicero, Illinois, he's not Italian, he stays there, he loses hundreds of millions of dollars. How is it he was never fired? How is it that only now, so late, Europe is catching on to this scandal? Why did it take so long? Well, one of the answers is that when Roberto Calvi was murdered in London, hanging from Blackfriars Bridge, he had gone to Switzerland for papers that probably would have explained where the money went. But then whoever hung him off the bridge, they have to pay him $1 million. If they kill that guy, they'll have to give him money. The murders will keep up. There will be a cause and effect to this scandal. We'll keep it updated every week and maybe get on to some other stories next week, because it's so pertinent when heads of companies like Charter Oil and Lockheed are murdered. There's never anything the next day in the paper. You're going to see a lot of individuals affected. You're going to see corporations and banks affected. And hopefully, say, the work that we researchers have done into these particular assassinations that go back to the Permindex organization and the Swiss banks, hopefully, if all this gets unfolded, we may get right back to those very teams who took away the elections in this country, who shot John Kennedy, who shot Robert Kennedy. These connections go back to Centro Mondiale in Italy, in Rome, in Switzerland, and that's why they're important, because they affected us 20 years ago. The country is still suffering from them. The people in power are vulnerable, and now the news media is willing to explain and expose them a little better. So we'll see what happens next week. There's always massive news every week. Follow the pieces. I hope they're not confusing for you, and we'll update it again next week. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.